Let's start with the voice playing on an old radio, accompanied by the sound of the spoon stirring in the tea glass and the aroma of coffee filling the air. We were sitting there, me and Mr. Daniel, facing each other at a simple table inside an old local cafe in city. Its decor is old and comforting to the heart. When we sit there, it feels like all our worries have lifted. We could say that this cafe is the source of happiness for us. My friend sits there day and night. The gatherings without him just aren't the same. For example, the day I'm telling you about now, December 10th, 1998, was a Thursday. I remember we were sitting there, just me and Daniel alone. I remember how much we talked. We kept laughing and watching Leo until suddenly, then Leo, the owner of the cafe, came over to our table. He was there to collect the empty tea glasses. As he picked up the glasses, he looked at one of them and asked Daniel, "Since when have you been sitting here at the cafe?" Daniel replied, "Since 5 hours, Leo." Daniel then said, "Since 5 hours? Well, that's good." At that moment, Leo placed the glass on and said to Daniel, "You're the one who's going to make me go broke with this cafe." He started to walk away, but suddenly stopped, turned around, and came back to us. Daniel said, "I'm not ordering anything else, just another coffee." Leo looked to me and said, "What about you? Aren't you going to order anything?" I replied, "I didn't order anything." Leo said, "I'm not talking about the circumstances you're in. I'm talking about the same issue." Daniel then adjusted himself and looked at me asking, "What issue are you talking about with Leo?" Leo's smile confirmed it. I nervously laughed and said, "Leo, remind me what the issue is because I'm starting to get scared." Daniel's pants were practically shaking at this point. Leo grabbed his dirty towel and threw it on the table, then leaned closer to me and said, "Aren't you going to come with me to the cemetery tonight?" I said, "Leo, please explain." He then smiled mischievously and said, "Aren't you going to come with me to dig up the grave?" That was Daniel's reaction that day. As for me, I stayed quiet because I knew what Leo was talking about. He had hinted at this story before on TV, and ever since then, he's been insisting on taking me to the cemetery at night. Daniel, hearing this for the first time, was so shocked that he grabbed Leo's hand and made him sit with us, saying, "Sit down, Leo, and tell me what this is all about. I'll order some hot milk instead of tea." Leo looked at him and said, "Fine." He then sat down and said, "Come here, boy, let me take you there and bring you back with a story the whole town will talk about." I stayed quiet and didn't respond, but Daniel, full of enthusiasm, said, "Where are we going, Leo?" "Let's go." I looked at him and said, "Are you serious? Do you even know what's behind this story to be so excited?" Daniel replied, "It doesn't matter. The important thing is that I'm excited and want to go." I told him, "All right, calm down." Leo then looked at me and said, "Listen, son, this will only take half an hour and you'll never regret it. I promise you'll come back with a story worth telling." Daniel said, "Please, I really want to go." I stayed quiet, lit a cigarette, leaned back on the chair and let my mind wander for a bit. Then in that moment, Leo got up from the table and said, "We sit face to face until we finish the shift at 12. If you're coming with me, let me know, and we'll be there in 15 minutes. After that, Leo left us. At that moment, my eyes fell on Daniel, and I realized I hadn't seen that much excitement in his eyes in a long time. It wasn't just excitement, it was a defeat in the face of our curiosity, which had brought us back to that night and forced me to stay up late at the cafe. After enjoying the atmosphere with the voice of radio and the aroma of coffee, I found myself sitting there anxious with a voice in my head, repeating one phrase, "What will happen?" The night went on until my phone rang at 12, and Daniel said, "So, are we going?" I stayed quiet, just staring at him, worried that someone might stop us. I looked around and saw Leo sitting on his motorcycle, staring at us silently. I kept hesitating until suddenly I got up and said to Daniel, "Let's go." He stood up, excited, and we moved towards Leo, who was smiling his usual mischievous smile, sitting on his motorcycle. Daniel jumped on behind him, and I got on after him. We moved that night, heading towards the hospital west of town. At around 12:15, we were riding behind Leo on his motorcycle. That night, he didn't say a single word, as if he was leaving us to our thoughts, imagining what might happen to us there. A terrifying and strange experience. The cemetery west of town is one of the oldest in North, so old that it's no longer used for burials. Leo had insisted on taking us there so we could come back with a story the whole town would talk about. I don't know why he offered us this adventure, but it was clear that the three of us were alike because Leo's curiosity seemed to drive him just like ours. He had been pressuring me for over a month to go to the cemetery with him, and every time he saw me, he would sit with me at the cafe and tell me stories. Some he had experienced himself, others he had heard from people. One of the stories he told me was about Jack, one of the oldest bodies buried in the cemetery, buried there in the late 1960s. Everyone who goes to the cemetery at night says they see his grave open, and when they return in the morning, they find it closed. The strange thing is that all the graves in the cemetery are made of clay, so it's not easy for them to open and close like that. I had heard this story from Leo and others many times, and each time I heard it, I believed it more, which might be why I agreed to go with him and Daniel that night. My curiosity was just too strong. Now you might be wondering, what is this cemetery? Well, I asked Leo the same question that night on the way there, and he replied, the cemetery got its name a long time ago because people were always afraid of it. Everyone who went there at night to bury or visit someone always felt fear and cowardice, and from then on, it became known as the Cemetery of Cowardice. The name comes from the word coward. That was the last conversation we had on the motorcycle because we were almost there. The road to the cemetery that night was strange. The closer we got, the more we felt isolated from the town. You couldn't hear any cars or noise, just the sound of crickets and the smell of agriculture and dirt. It was my first time getting close to that part of town. The western side of town is mostly farmland, and the only place people go to with any life is, unfortunately, the hospital and the morgue. This area made me think that all of Leo's stories about the cemetery might be true, and that's probably why we went there with him. When we arrived, the weather was freezing cold, and darkness covered everything around us. The only source of light was a fire burning in front of the cemetery gate, where an elderly man was sitting. He was the cemetery's guard, a man named Sam, a true upper with dark skin, around 60 or 70 years old. That night we saw him sitting by the fire, staring at us as we got off the motorcycle and stood to the side. Leo went over to him, greeted him warmly, and they started chatting. I could tell they knew each other well. Meanwhile, me and Leo looked around. The sound of crickets and the cawing of crows flying in circles above the cemetery, along with the strong wind carrying the smell of plants and humidity, made me look into Daniel's eyes. I understood his look perfectly. It meant we were walking into a place we might not come back from. That was the truth, honestly. The place truly instilled fear in the heart. We kept looking around, waiting for Leo until the moment came when we heard the sound of the cemetery's old rusty iron gate opening. Jack, the guard, opened it, and we looked at Leo, who gestured for us to follow him. He said to Jack, "Just 10 minutes, and we'll be back." Then he signaled for us to enter. We moved quietly, me and Daniel, but as we were passing through the gate, Jack grabbed my arm. My whole body froze in that moment, and I looked at him anxiously. His eyes held 1,000 stories, and after a few seconds, he handed me something. I held it and realized it was an old. My heart started racing with fear, maybe because my mind had grasped the danger of the place I was about to enter. I looked at Daniel, who was also starting to feel fear, even though we hadn't even entered yet. That just shows how heavy the atmosphere was. As we stepped inside, our eyes started scanning the place. There were many trees, the smell of dirt was overwhelming, and graves were everywhere, built in an old style with clay domes on top. Most of the graves were dug up and open, as if people had taken their relatives' remains from there. But some were still closed, with cacti planted in front of them, covering their entrances. The cemetery felt like a gap from the past, and we could feel time standing still in an ancient era. We kept looking around, still not moving deeper inside. But my friend, if we had gone further, you wouldn't believe what we would have seen. As we stood there, Leo came up behind us and said, "I didn't lie to you, did I? You've seen the place with your own eyes and you'll see more. But I advise you not to go too deep into the cemetery because what's inside are the oldest tombs built here, and Jack warned me not to let you get too close." I looked at Leo and said, "Don't worry, we're too scared to do that anyway." He laughed and said, "I know you're cowards, but curiosity is the first and last motivator for humans, and I know you well. I've warned you, and now it's up to you." He left us at that moment and went to stand with Jack. I then looked at Daniel, who smiled at me, and I understood that smile perfectly. We turned our backs to Uncle Saeed and Jack, and finally started moving deeper inside. With every step we took, we felt the cemetery swallowing us, isolating us completely from life. The further we went, the more the graves seemed to multiply. They were dilapidated in a strange way, and above us, we could still hear the cawing of the crows. When I looked up at the sky, I felt like they were watching us. It was true, we were strangers in their territory, and at any moment, they could attack us violently. So I told Daniel to try to move quietly so we wouldn't seem like a threat. But I was practically talking to myself because Daniel was acting like he was walking in their territory, playing with everything around him. For example, as we walked, he kept getting closer to the open graves until he reached one and looked inside. I pulled him back and said, "What are you doing? If the crows feel threatened, we won't survive what they'll do to us." Daniel said, "Come here, stop talking nonsense. They're just birds." I said, "Birds? Fine, come on." My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed him to the open grave. We leaned in and looked inside. Daniel lit a lighter and started illuminating the grave. We looked for a bit, and then I saw Daniel start digging in the dirt with his hand. I said, "What are you doing, you idiot?" "Calm down." He said, "Wait a second," and suddenly his hand pulled something out of the dirt. He held it up and said, "What is this?" I said, "It's probably a human bone that's decomposed." He threw it away quickly, and I said, "Stop playing around and calm down." But he kept digging in the grave. As we were focused on that, I heard someone behind us say, "Hello." I turned around and said, "Hi." Neither Daniel nor I moved. I said, "Who's there?" Daniel said, "What did you hear?" I said, "Someone just greeted us and walked past." Daniel said, "Where?" "There's no one here." I said, "I swear someone just greeted us." He said, "Maybe someone went out to buy something and is coming back." I said, "I'm telling you, Daniel, don't joke about these things." He said, "What's the big deal? They're just dead people. There's no danger." He started moving around quietly, looking around, and said, "I love this place. I think I'll come here every now and then to sit with Jack. At least he won't pressure me like Leo, saying I've been sitting here since 5 hours on one tea glass." After he said that, he suddenly said, "What's this?" and started moving slowly away from me. I followed him and said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Look at the ground in front of you." I looked and saw a large black crow buried up to its neck in the dirt. Daniel started getting closer to it, saying, "I've always heard the saying, birds of a feather flock together, but this is the first time I've seen it with my own eyes." I said, "First of all, it's birds of a feather flock together, and second, calm down. This looks like a trial." He said, "A trial? What do you mean?" I said, "A trial by the crows. What's wrong with you?" He said, "What does that mean?" "I don't understand why it's buried like this." I said, "Let's see." I started moving towards the crow, picked up a small rock from the ground, and threw it at the crow. It didn't even flinch. I looked at Daniel and said, "It's a trial. This crow is being punished for something it did." He said, "What did it do?" "Let's see." He started moving towards the crow, saying, "Hey, what's your crime, you crazy bird?" Suddenly, a flock of crows attacked him, and he fell to the ground. I quickly took off my jacket and ran towards him, waving it to scare the crows away. I pulled Daniel back, and we retreated. He stood there, swearing and saying, "They're just birds and they did this to me?" I said, "Shut up and calm down for a second." I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the trees around us. What I saw was terrifying. There weren't just a few crows. There were massive flocks of them sitting on every branch of the trees around us. Daniel stood next to me and said, "Oh my God, how many crows are there?" I said, "I told you we're in their territory, and what we saw earlier was a trial for that crow." He said, "But why did they attack me when I got close to it?" I said, "The crows have a system, almost like a government. They have trials and punishments, and that crow was being punished. When we got close to it, they attacked us because they wanted to face its punishment." Daniel, after hearing this, started walking with me quietly, step by step, as we moved deeper into the cemetery. The further we went, the older the graves became. They were more dilapidated, and these were probably the oldest tombs built in the cemetery. We definitely shouldn't have gone near them because this was the area Leo had warned us about. But our feet dragged us there, and our minds were completely disconnected, lost in the atmosphere around us. Daniel started looking around and said, "I've been to cemeteries with my family before, but the graves around us aren't for adults. They're for children. Look closely and you'll see." I started looking around and realized he was right. The graves we were standing near weren't for adults. They were for children, up to around 10 years old. When we first entered, the graves were much larger, so I realized Abu Daniel was right. We started moving around, and as we walked, I was sure that what made Jack warn Leo to keep us from going too deep was the thing we were about to hear, the sound of complete silence. No wind, no crows, not even the sound of insects. The place was dead, just like the people buried there. Daniel started getting closer to the graves, lighting his lighter and examining one of them. He said, "The dirt covering this grave is thick. It's clear Jack doesn't come here often, even though he's supposed to clean it regularly." I said, "All right, let's listen to them and leave." At that moment, Daniel said, "Wait a second," and started sitting in front of a grave, wiping the dirt off it. He lit his lighter and brought it close to the grave, focusing intently. I was confused and said, "What are you doing, Abu Daniel?" He looked at me and said, "I told you these are children's graves, but the writing here says otherwise. It says, 'Here lies Sam Singer, born in 1915, died in 1969. So the body buried here is 50 years old." I said, "How? Can't you see the size of the grave? It's too small." Daniel then got up and went to another grave, reading the inscription. He looked at me with confusion and said, "This grave is also for someone who was 40 years old. These graves are strange and don't make sense." He started getting up and checking the other graves, and I started looking around, wondering how there could be no logic in this. How could the people buried in these small graves have such large bodies? This part of the cemetery was extremely unsettling. I started moving towards Daniel to take him and leave, but then I heard a sound. Something had fallen on the ground behind me. I turned around and looked at the ground, seeing a brick lying in front of a closed grave. I started walking towards it, wondering how it had fallen and from where. I looked around confused, and then bent down to pick up the brick and placed it to the side. As I was bending down, I heard another sound. I quickly turned around, terrified, and saw an open grave. The grave was extremely dilapidated, and I walked towards it, scared and trembling. I got closer to the opening of the grave to listen, and in that moment, I heard the sound of breathing coming from inside. My body froze, and the grave was emitting warm air. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. As soon as I pointed the light inside the grave, I saw a human crouching inside, staring at me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and fell to the ground. Daniel came running towards me, saying, "What's wrong?" I pointed at the grave, terrified, and he understood. He grabbed me and said, "Let's get out of here. This place isn't safe. We need to leave without any more adventures." He started pulling me up, but at that moment he said, "Wait, let me get my lighter. It's expensive." And I left it there in front of the grave. I remembered that I had left it there when I ran towards him. Daniel started moving towards it, but after a few steps he stopped and turned to me with a look of extreme fear. He then slowly walked back and said, "This grave was closed when I left it, and now it's open." I said, "Sir, maybe someone came out to get something and is coming back." He said, "I swear it was closed. Please, let's just leave quickly." I said, "Calm down." At that moment, I spat and raised my hand, saying, "Maybe the person standing over there is the one who opened the grave and came out." Daniel looked up and saw what I was talking about, a human figure standing motionless in the darkness of the cemetery. We couldn't see any features. It was hunched over like an old man. Daniel started stuttering, saying, "Do you know how to run?" I said, "Yes, but I can't move my legs." The truth is, my legs were completely paralyzed at that moment. Suddenly, Daniel screamed at me, pushed me, and said, "Run!" We started running as fast as we could. And as we ran, we started hearing footsteps around us, as if a group of people were running around us in the cemetery. Kept screaming at me, "Run! Don't look back!" We kept running at full speed until we saw Leo running towards us, shouting, "Where were you? We've been looking for you." What happened inside? Jack said you turned the place into hell. I said we had no choice. He said, no choice. You're crazy. I told you not to go too deep. At that moment, I said, we're leaving now. Leo said, enough. Our time here is over. And with that, we left the cemetery, ending our adventure. It was a quick one, but it passed safely, and I hope you enjoyed the night with us. I want you to drop a like on the video below. It won't take much time, but it will mean a lot to me. What do you think? Are you ready for another adventure, or should we cancel? I'll see your responses in the comments below.